All right. Thanks, James, for an excellent keynote speech. My name is Alex Dean. I'm CEO and co-founder of Snowplow, and I'm really excited to be kicking off with the first of the vendor-specific talks for the Open Source Data Stack Conference. Let's get started. Just as a reminder, we have a Q&A taking place over on Discord. You can use this QR code to jump into that chat. Okay, so the Open Source Data Stack Conference, we're trying to do something a little bit different here. We're trying to come up with a fictitious company called Yukon, and we're trying to show how various different open source vendors that are part of the modern data stack can come together to help solve use cases for that vendor. And so I'm from Snowplow, and we're all about getting behavioral data into the data warehouse to power use cases. So before I start talking about Snowplow and what we do, let's do a bit of reorientation around Yukon. Yukon is a fictitious global e-commerce company. It's looking to compete through sophisticated use of data. It's very diverse. It sells across a bunch of different categories, including kids, books, games, tools, jewelry, all sorts of stuff. Has a modern data team, and its digital estate consists of an e-commerce website built on Ruby on Rails, a mobile app built on React Native, and emails that are sent out to customers and prospective customers via Marketo. So that's Yukon at a high level. So it really goes without saying that a global e-commerce vendor like Yukon is going to generate an immense amount of data. So that data is going to be across finance, across sales, across stock, production, customer data, logistics, partnership data, all sorts of different things. It's just the nature of things these days. And some of that data, so the customer data is a big pot there. And then within customer, you're going to have things like CRM data, email lists, surveys, focus groups, and you're going to have this type of data called behavioral data. Now, what is behavioral data? Well, simply put, it's data that describes how the shoppers or prospective shoppers at Yukon are going to behave. So it's collected as event data from Yukon's digital platforms, such as web, such as mobile, such as email. And this is a really enormous data set, which presents some really great opportunities, but also some real challenges. I think the other thing to say about behavioral data is it's both broad and deep. So it's very broad. It covers a lot of different activity that you'd be interested in about your customers, but it's also very deep. It can be very, very granular. It can give you a really deep insight into what your customers are doing. So if we think specifically about the behavioral data that's going to be generated from Yukon's digital properties, it's going to be really, really rich. And I've got some examples here. So examples like opening an email, changing your account preferences, selecting garment sizes, viewing recommended search results, filing support requests when you're having a problem with the Yukon site, and of course, checking out from the online store. So if we think about across website, across mobile, across email, there's going to be a really, really rich, broad and deep granular stream of behavioral data coming out of Yukon's digital properties. So having given that framing around behavioral data and what it is, let's return to the kinds of problems that Yukon wants to solve with this data. So if you remember from the previous session, Yukon is looking to understand their key metrics, and Yukon is also looking to enhance the customer experience for Yukon's big spenders. And the exciting thing here, and this is why I'm talking to you today, is that behavioral data can help power both of these really important use cases for Yukon. So if we take the first use case, if we take understanding Yukon's key metrics, we've got a list here of key metrics and we've got descriptions of them. And what I've done is I've taken the parts of those key metrics that is only available by collecting the behavioral data from Yukon's customers, and I've highlighted that in purple. And so really the ones that I haven't highlighted in purple, it would be possible to pull those out of transactional systems, for example, using Meltano. But the pieces in purple, you need to have a technology like Snowplow active in those digital properties, really kind of collecting and generating and collecting that behavioral data. So to give those specific examples on this slide, retention. So the activity of users on the site is going to be very important to track that track those digital footprints on their website. On email, the same thing. So whoever's opening emails, you're going to typically track that using a kind of a pixel inside the emails that will send that data into Snowplow. Same with ads. So you can add Snowplow tracking into an ad unit, and then you can see when a shopper or a previous customer or a prospective shopper last interacted with that ad unit. That last one, product conversion, so product look to book ratio, is quite an interesting metric. It's essentially the ratio between how much people are looking at a property, at a product inside the shopping catalog versus actually adding it to cart and then buying it. And so those essentially product impressions, so how many times those products are being looked at, again, is something you would track through Snowplow. So what you can see from here is an awful lot of Yukon's key metrics need to be very heavily informed by the behavioral data, so how the customers and potential customers are interacting with Yukon's digital properties online. The second use case, remember, this is enhancing the customer experience for Yukon's high-value customers. And the essential idea here is that we identify those high-value customers, and then we're going to do a few things with them. So using Marketo, we're going to enroll them into the right rewards program. Using Zendesk, we're going to make sure that their help desk tickets are answered more quickly. And we're also going to remind them of offers related to their recent purchases on Facebook. And so this whole use case is going to lead to a great session later, where Brian is going to explain how to activate these things using Grouperoo. But in the meantime, it's important to stress that the behavioral data that we've talked about is going to really, really help identify Yukon's high-value customers. So we can use these behavioral signals around interactions with the site, interactions with the mobile app, behaviors on email. We can use those to inform who are the most valuable customers, who are the ones that are showing really promising behaviors that should be activated using reverse ETL later. So I've done a bit of a framing here. I've talked about Yukon. I've talked about the use cases they want to solve, and I've given a brief introduction to behavioral data. The next piece to answer is, well, what is Snowplow? Simply put, Snowplow is a batteries included behavioral data engine. It includes tracking SDKs. It has a schema registry for data quality. It has enrichments to make the behavioral data richer, more easy to analyze, and it has powerful loaders to get that behavioral data into different data warehouses. It's essentially an open source data processing pipeline. So what does Snowplow do? It loads that behavioral data into Snowflake, Redshift, and BigQuery. We're focused on Snowflake for Yukon. That's their cloud data warehouse of choice. And it supports other destinations as well. So before we get on to the other destinations, in terms of the warehouses, I've updated the core diagram for the conference with this set of the warehouses. Essentially, Snowplow is sitting in between the Yukon digital estate and the data warehouse, and it's essentially streaming or kind of micro batch loading that data into the warehouse pretty fast. In terms of the other destinations, so Snowplow also supports S3, Postgres, Kafka, Kinesis, Google Cloud PubSub, Elasticsearch, and a handful of others as well. But that's where we sit inside the stack. And an important point as well, given the upcoming talk from Julia at DBT, Snowplow is all in on DBT. So DBT models reduce the time to value in building analytics and data products for companies like Yukon on top of our behavioral data. We have a DBT model for Snowplow behavioral data that comes from websites, and we're working on a second DBT model for the Snowplow behavioral data that comes from mobile apps. And you can see one of the Snowplow models featured in the DBT hub on the right here. So yeah, we see DBT as a very important part of taking that very granular data that is landing in the data warehouse and essentially aggregating that up, layering it up, and making it a bit easier for analysts, data engineers, analytics engineers, and so on to work with. Okay, so this is an open source data stack conference. Snowplow is open source. We've been proudly open source since we launched the project back in 2012. Snowplow is available under an Apache 2 license. We launched Snowplow originally to make this kind of technology, this idea of a kind of a behavioral data engine, accessible to far more organizations. So back in 2012, when Yali and I started the project that then evolved into the company, we'd been doing analytics projects for clients in the UK, and they had access, they'd been able to share with us very granular transactional data from their own customers. So for example, extracts from CRM, ERP, that sort of thing. But when it came to how their customers were interacting on their websites, they didn't really have that much. So they would say things like log into Google Analytics and get what you need, but that wasn't what we wanted. We wanted that super granular kind of behavioral data that I talked about earlier. And from various projects we'd done before 2012, we knew how to build that technology. And so that's what we then turned into the original release of Snowplow back in 2012, running cloud native on AWS and Apache 2 license from day one. And so our goal really was to get it out there and say, you know, you don't need to have a big data engineering team that builds this stuff themselves. You could be a much smaller organization, but very data ambitious, data curious, and just download our software from GitHub, run it in your own AWS account, and start to kind of work with this very granular data. And so I guess another way of putting that is, you don't need to be a Yukon, you don't need to be, you know, a global e-commerce business to be able to work with Snowplow. You can download it and go from there. I think a few other points about open source are really important to stress as well. So to us, open source and the open source data stack is very important from a data sovereignty perspective. So this is an important point to make. The data flowing through Snowplow, it is your customer's behavioral data. It is not Snowplow's data. So we just see ourselves as a software vendor. We've built this great engine. You download it, you run it. Even when you're a paying customer of Snowplow, you're not sending any of that data to us. We're not kind of in the middle in any way. I think another really important point about open source, and this I think will come up in the other talks as well today and the rest of the week, is it really does help increase assurance. So as a data team or data practitioners who are working with Snowplow or other open source data stack tools, you have that ability to go in, audit or inspect all the data processing code. So you can go in and understand how it's working. You can understand what the different edge cases are, how it handles them. If data's not being processed in the way you expect, you can go in and look at the tests and try and understand why. So it really, really helps when you're trying to build, you know, serious business critical data products and, you know, maybe financial reporting on top of this kind of data or whatever it is. It's really, really important to have that assurance. Another thing that's really important is, of course, encouraging those kind of long tail code contributions. So at Snowplow, we can't build everything. There will be features, there will be enrichments, there will be destinations that people want Snowplow to support that aren't up there on our roadmap. And so open source makes it possible to do those things. And I think going further than that, the whole architecture of Snowplow is very modular, very protocol oriented. And so it's quite easy to plug into the Snowplow architecture at different points along the way and go from there and kind of add your own functionality in there. Last but not least, I think this is an incredibly important part of open source. It really does help remove the risk of vendor lock-in. So, you know, there are some great and very successful proprietary technologies in the modern data stack, but all the open source ones really do kind of give you that confidence that the software will be around for a long time, that it will continue to be permissively licensed, and that you can build your analyses or your data products or whatever else it is that you need to do as a business on top of your data with some confidence. And Snowplow, as an example, we've been around since 2012, so coming up on our 10-year anniversary, which is pretty cool. So I wanted to also flag that we have a commercial version of Snowplow called Snowplow Insights. So if the open source is great, but we've also developed over the last few years a kind of a studio UI to help solve the organizational challenges of working with this behavioral data at scale. So as you become a larger company, as you start to face some of the challenges that are you know, a big brand like a Yukon would face, you start to see these interesting challenges with behavioral data. And this is what our kind of Snowplow Insights and the UI within it can really help tackle. So there's a screenshot on the right-hand side of part of the data quality interface of Snowplow Insights. And then on the left, some of those kind of questions, gnarly questions that data practitioners, data teams, data consumers, data producers might find themselves asking, like, how do we decide what behavioral data to collect, and how should that data be structured? How do we rapidly iterate our behavioral data collection to meet our evolving needs? How do we build assurance in the accuracy and completeness of the data? Another thing that's quite interesting about Snowplow Insights is that it's sold as private SaaS. And don't worry, I'll explain what private SaaS is, but I think it's a great model for open source data infrastructure. Fundamentally, private SaaS is software as a service. So Snowplow Insights is sold as a software as a service offering, but it runs behind your firewall inside your own VPC. And so this is really important. It means that the behavioral data never leaves your AWS or Google Cloud subaccount. That means that you retain your end-to-end data sovereignty, even if you're a paying customer of Snowplow. We deploy, monitor, scale, and upgrade the underlying Snowplow technology for you, so it stays up to date and it stays highly performant. And that pipeline, that kind of underlying engine, sitting inside your own subaccount, then communicates back to our centrally hosted Studio UI. And I've got some logos here of Snowplow users and Snowplow Insights customers. So, okay, so we've talked a bit about the use cases that Yukon has. We've talked a bit about behavioral data. We've then talked a bit about Snowplow itself, both the open source version of Snowplow and the commercial version. How would a company like Yukon set up and use Snowplow? Let's talk about this for a few moments. So first things first, Yukon would define schemas for specific events like add to cart and specific entities like perhaps apparel product. So what do we mean by this? The events are the things that capture a specific action that a customer or potential customer has taken. So add to cart is a great example of that. And then entities describe almost the business records, the business entities that are important to Yukon. And those will be structured out, and those entities can be added in alongside the events during the tracking process. So fundamentally, having defined those events and entities, those definitions will be added into the Snowplow schema registry. The next step will be to implement tracking across web and across mobile using our SDKs, and also probably add pixel tracking into the emails. That tracking will be done by the front-end application teams, and they'll make care when they're doing that to send in the right events and the right entities into the Snowplow pipeline as they're going. Once that data is flowing through into Snowplow, there's then a bit of configuration to be done on the Snowplow pipeline, for example, configuring the enrichment, so we'll add extra data points to Snowplow. And then you'll go into the data warehouse and deploy the DBT models that will take that very granular behavioral data that's landing in Snowflake and then do further processing on it, add kind of essentially extra aggregation layers to it to make it easier for analysts and engineers to work with. And then that will be the final step. So working with the Snowplow data in the data warehouse in Snowflake. So we talked a bit at the top about behavioral data, and I've just mentioned this idea of defining events and defining entities and sending those through into the pipeline. I wanted to give you a sense of kind of what that means and why it's a little bit different from some of the perhaps event tracking technologies that you might be familiar with that grew up over the last 10 years. So I've got a sample on the right-hand side of a potential Snowplow event that Yukon would send in. The data is a JSON payload, and it is sent in, as you can see here, with a reference to the associated schema. That schema is namespaced, so you can see that it belongs to com.yukon, and it's also versioned. And that's really, really important because that versioning allows the Yukon team to evolve their definitions of these structures of these events and these entities over time. And the way that Snowplow works is you can be sending in different versions of those events and entities simultaneously at the same time. So Snowplow can kind of progressively, gracefully evolve different data structures that you're sending in as your understanding of the business problems you're trying to solve evolves. Now, as well as the event JSON that I'm showing here, remember that an array of associated entities could be sent in as well. So for example, an entity that's describing the current shopping cart could be sent in with every event that's relevant as well. Now, all of this data flows through into Snowplow. It gets validated and it gets stored in the data warehouse, in this case in Snowflake, in a Snowplow curated activity stream table. So what do we mean by validation? Fundamentally, when these events land in the Snowplow pipeline, Snowplow will go and look up the schema definition from the registry, the schema registry, and it will cross-check the data that it's received against that registry schema. If it passes, so if this data payload matches the schema definition, then the data will be flowed through into the warehouse successfully. If the data is corrupt or it's invalid, then it will be moved into a separate flow, into kind of a bad bucket, if you will, a bad stream for further processing and, for example, for event recovery. So Snowplow, it's very important to Snowplow technology that all of the data that flows through is kind of properly validated, but also that it's possible to recover data that's incorrect or invalid for further processing. So, okay, this is exciting, hopefully. How do you get started with Snowplow? So there's two options. So the first is spinning up our open source, and the second is our hosted free trial. There are other options as well. You can deploy a full fat pipeline and things like that, working through all the different components in our GitHub, but I'd really recommend starting with one of these two. So first is spinning up our open source using the open source quick start. So what is the open source quick start? It is a set of Terraform modules to easily set up a Snowplow pipeline on AWS for destinations. So destinations that the quick start can load the behavioral data into. It supports Kinesis, S3, Postgres, and Elasticsearch. At the moment, the quick start only sets up the pipeline on AWS, but we do have support for Google Cloud Platform and BigQuery coming soon. So watch the space. And I would say that the open source quick start is a really good gateway for setting up a Snowplow production pipeline, open source pipeline, which would allow you to load S3, Redshift, Snowflake, and things like that as well. So that's the first option. The second option is our hosted free trial. So we just actually launched this a week ago. It's called Try Snowplow. You can find this on our website. It's easily deployed in 5 minutes. It doesn't require you to have an AWS or a Google Cloud Platform account. And this one is a really good fit for data analysts who don't have experience in DevOps, maybe don't have access to a cloud account yourselves, but you do want to learn about the Snowplow data, and you do want to understand kind of how rich that behavioral data is, and why it's a very powerful thing to work with and build data products on top of, very rich analyses and so forth. Try Snowplow is a good gateway into our commercial products, Snowplow Insights. It's also a good gateway into potentially taking this demo, this trial, and showing it to data engineers or DevOps practitioners in your organization, and showing them kind of the potential of Snowplow. All right. Well, look, big thanks for listening. You can ask any questions over on our Discord, and you can certainly reach me on the below. So like I said, I'm CEO and co-founder of Snowplow. You'll find me on Twitter as Alex C.R. Dean, not super catchy, but that's me on Twitter. And there's my email at Snowplow as well, if you want to drop me a note. And just a reminder that we have the Q&A taking place over on Discord at the moment. And so, yeah, big thanks for that. And hopefully with this talk, you can visualize now why behavioral data is really important to Yukon, and how Snowplow plays an important part in the open source data stack, generating and then delivering that behavioral data into Snowflake for Yukon, ready for DBT to pick up the workload. In parallel, you're also going to have a technology like Meltano that's pulling in other data, transactional data fundamentally, from databases, from SaaS tools, and getting that into the warehouse. Having that Snowplow plus Meltano data all sitting in the warehouse together is going to set you up in a very powerful way for downstream analyses and helps UConn with its use cases. So do check out Taylor A. Murphy coming up next from Meltano talking about ELT. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.